Anime has pretty much become a global entertainment phenomenon, and as it reaches out across the world, it's started to take on projects from outside its home nation. One source of foreign media that has become increasingly popular for source material for anime lately is South Korea, whose manhwa and web novels have garnered several adaptations in recent years. And that's where A Returner's Magic Should Be Special comes in. A South Korean web novel series about a mage who, after saving the world from the corruption of a shadow world, is caught up in a secondary disaster that miraculously sends him back to the past. Desir Herman, given a second chance at dealing with the disaster that befell his world, takes the opportunity to try and nip the problem in the bud in hopes that he might be able to save all the people close to him, who died as a result of the events in the first timeline. By using his magical expertise from his first life and the knowledge of his close friends' personal lives and temperaments, he's able to change their fates, even if just a little, before the beginning of the tragedy that would change the world forever. Now on paper, these sorts of returner stories are something I do like. I'd lump ReZero, Ragna Crimson, and Tokyo Revengers into the same category, even though one of those should just be completely forgotten. The concept is the kind of thing we've all dreamt about at least one time in our life. What would it be like to get the chance to relive your life with the knowledge you have now? It always sets up a fairly interesting story, but the issue, more often than not, is how the writer delivers on all of that. And that certainly is the case here, because one of the major flaws of this anime is that everything felt so overwhelmingly half-baked, from certain plot elements to how magic works and so on. There was just too much of it that felt as though it hadn't been given a truly creative second thought to make it more original to the series. That, and it also fails to elaborate on certain things that should have been major parts of the plot. For example, while the overwhelming plot of Desir saving his friends and the world doesn't really feel off, the oversimplified and disastrously mishandled classism subplot, a major element of the original problem of the original timeline, comes off as so cheesy it makes Black Clover look like a Tolkien work. Let me explain a bit further before you jump down my throat about that. This subplot doesn't even come close to the level of handling other anime that have dealt with the same issue portray, namely ones like One Piece and Black Clover. In this series, so much nuance and finesse was lacking in the way it was handled that it ultimately failed to capture any good moments based on this subplot. There isn't a moment in this story where it doesn't come off as blunt, forced, or poorly crafted. Part of that is the fact that the story just kinda jumps right into the prejudice as one of the main factors for the season, then expects you not to feel like it's shoehorned in because it needs something to try to add depth to the cast, which is almost entirely bland and boring. It doesn't actually take time to make you feel like it's a part of the world. But the major reason for this is the fact that the characters involved in all of the actions involving this subplot are one-dimensional, poorly written, and incompetent. Most of the time, the supposed discrimination is enacted by antagonists so corny they might as well have been twirling their mustaches in every scene they were in. The main one, a fat blonde professor at the academy whose name I couldn't even be bothered to look up while scripting this video, is such a cartoony level of villainous that it ruins any of the story's progression he's involved in. He genuinely has no reason to exist other than to play the part of the noble outraged by competent peasants. And honestly, he lacks the competency to truly be some big antagonist within the academy, or feel like he's doing anything of meaning. He never takes the opportunity to sabotage protagonists. He never schemes up plots to keep them down. All he does is say, haha, no, commoners aren't allowed. And because he comes off as just another oafish antagonist, he fails to deliver anything even remotely resembling good character work. And then we get to the other students, and the classism acts carried out by students are almost equally poorly written. But in this case, a few actually do attempt to get some shoddy reasoning. The most well thought out part of it is a pathetic attempt at trying to employ some nuance in the story, which almost unilaterally fails. In the first case, we'll call him Chad because I couldn't be bothered to remember his name either, was the son of a noble family killed during a revolution. Now, it's at least understandable why he would have his prejudices. A good step in the right direction, but the story never really does anything with it. Chad just exists to be angry at one of the protagonists, Romantica, and antagonize her during a combat exam. Oh, you were honest with me about being a commoner when I asked you out? Well, screw you! It's a laughably bad attempt at trying to generate some personal beef for Romantica to overcome. It doesn't lead to anything other than a battle that would have happened regardless, and because his backstory is only explored in a 5-minute flashback, it has no real weight in the story. The second guy, who I'll just call Bully, because again, he was so uninteresting that I didn't even bother to keep track of his name, is just the ego-driven jackass who's pissed that another of the protagonists, Prom, didn't go down as easily as he had hoped. That's it. That's all the reason he needs to beef with this guy. It's not even like Bully lost the match they were in. He won! But because Prom actually put up a fight, it's now a reason to beef over it. From then on, the character is just a one-dimensional hater who lurks in the background until the final combat exam in the first season, where he decides he's gonna pick on Prom. The only one who makes any sense at all in this is Azest, whose skills should have made her the top student and allowed her to take first place in the entrance exams. But she lost to Desir, a humiliation she wouldn't allow, and makes it her personal mission to prove herself superior in the end. She doesn't really go out of her way to bully or harass, but she does declare her intention to prove that she's better, and makes Desir her personal target and singles him out in battle just to prove her superiority. Finally, a half-decent reason for two characters to be beefing. Someone who's never really been challenged finding a rival in an unexpected place, and worse yet, one who humiliated her in their first meeting by outsmarting her. So outside of needing them to be rivals for the main characters in the final exam, so to speak, you never really see much of these characters doing anything to get back at the protagonists outside of targeting them in that exam. And thus, outside of being stuck with less resources while a comically incompetent villain tries to keep them down, Desir, Romantica, and Prom never struggle with the state of the class system. They never have to face any consequences of trying to move up. They never really meet any resistance other than some comically bad haha no moments. Which is really bad considering that is one of the major plot points that causes a lot of the trouble in the first timeline. The issue Desir wanted to fix was the fact that so many of the commoner mages he was friends with who had promising talents never got the attention and development they needed from schools. Seriously, this is something that should have been the focus of multiple seasons, but it amounts to a flimsy subplot of the first season that means jack shit. And thus, it ultimately comes down to the school to be the primary mechanism for displaying that commoners are below the nobility, because otherwise you wouldn't really know. While there are two classes based on the station of your birth, which would make sense, it again suffers from half-assed writing. Beta class, the commoners, has fewer resources to work with than alpha class. But this never becomes an issue for our protagonists, as all they ever had to do was clean out an old storage room. That is quite literally the only challenge they face because of the supposed systemic discrimination, leaving them destitute for needed resources. And with the chubby blonde guy doing nothing but denying them access to the upper echelons of the school, or actively trying to keep them down, you'd think it would have been much harder for them to get into alpha class or get promoted. But no, one exam and they're all good. And so they brush away a huge part of the overall problem that was good mages not getting proper training. An entire important element of the story being dismissed as an afterthought. And then we move on into the broader world of a Returner's Magic Should Be special, and there's some anachronisms and bullshittery that just feel like a cheese fest as well. I mean, first of all is the idea of magic tablets and cell phones. There's hardly ever a setting where this kind of stuff is done right. But it doesn't stop there. Alongside all the talk of nobles, class, and so on, they have modern shopping malls and arcade games. The concept of magic power is more often than not just used as an excuse to implement electronic technology in a fantasy world in order to modernize the setting. What that generally means is you end up having a bunch of elements in society that feel like they are out of their time. Which, if you're really trying to write a good story, you don't want people to look at something and have it take them out of the story because, wait, why is there a modern shopping mall next to a castle? And at that point, it just starts to feel like you're losing the plot. I know it's technically a minor detail that isn't really relevant, but when you're building a world, you at least want to keep everything within the same time period. There is a lot I can handle in a swords and magic setting that won't bother me if it's actually creative and fun. Ragnik Crimson has firearms, and I was willing to accept that considering the large majority of them were bolt action and early repeating rifles. However, the moment they started pulling out M4s, I was calling bullshit on that. So yeah, the idea of shopping malls and arcades in a fantasy-esque setting just isn't doing it for me. Scratch that, I think it's several steps too far. Even the Eminence and Shadow kept within the logical limits of its technological time period, even while Shadow Garden was able to accomplish a bunch of bullshit things using Sid's ramblings about his previous life. And next up is the magic system in the series, and the only thing I can really say about it is that it feels so uncreative. Putting aside the awful animation used for it, it's super basic and lacks any amount of serious depth that would make it a good power system. Every person has an element and seems limited to using that element alone. For example, Romantica has wind magic, Azest has ice magic, Desir has fire magic, and then he also has anti-magic. But outside of that rule and the idea of mana, there basically seems to be no rules defining how magic is supposed to be used. And because of that, the whole system just feels flat, like, well, I need a power system in order to justify how all this can happen, so why not just use magic? Everyone understands magic, I don't need to explain magic. At least Black Clover had the decency of explaining that you need a grimoire to use magic, and that you can only use the spells that are in your grimoire. So yeah, the magic lacks any sort of flair. It's just the standard wind blast, fireball, ice wall kind of stuff. It did at least take a bit of a creative turn when Azest used what I can effectively describe as an Ice World domain expansion, and then imbued it into her sword. That and the idea of Desir being able to deconstruct and redirect spells are about the only truly creative elements of the magic in this whole damn show. Which means that the magic system isn't awful, but it's flavorless. And most of the cast isn't much better. Romantica is pretty much tsundere light, where she acts all mean and tough but loves her friends. She's a long-range fighter who snipes at people with precision wind spells. A nice concept, but it didn't have any sort of uniqueness to it that made it seem fun or different, so it might as well have been generic energy blast from like literally any anime. Prom was the speed over might swordsman twink who exists solely to serve as BL fodder for the series. I'll admit he was actually a character I kind of liked for a bit, since he had this whole arc where he questioned his own origins and several things that his life was built on. But his fight scenes lacked flair and his character developed into a simping fanboy, which ultimately spoiled what good could have come out of him. He had decent backstory and development for a time, but it just wasn't enough in the long run as, again, he just turned into a simping fanboy, and was another cog in the plot once the series hit the halfway point. The main character, Desir, is the tactical one, constantly outthinking his opponents and using everyone's abilities to his advantage. But his mission and motives feel empty because most of the people he's trying to save are not in the main cast, and you don't get much connection to the original Romantica in Prom outside of some brief flashbacks to their deaths in the first timeline, and some internal dialogue from Desir himself. Unfortunately, no matter how he was written or whether or not you got the payoff, the conflicts he was involved in were still going to undermine him. In this case, considering Desir has come back in time and has all of his future magic knowledge, you would really want him to come off as impressive and cunning. So the idea that he's outsmarting people is a good turn, but his victories still feel worthless because the antagonists are so poorly written and showcased that he doesn't ever really seem to earn them. Being victorious over them just seems like a matter-of-fact thing rather than anything impressive. So in the end, if I had to pick my favorite character out of this whole series, it would be Azest, the rival character turned ally upon realizing she can reach greater heights with Desir's help. Her magical abilities are by far the most interesting, the aforementioned domain-type powers she can imbue into her sword, and her character arc is by far the most complete. At first, she hates Desir because he bested her on the first day of school. But after being defeated again in the next round of exams due to his overall planning, she realizes that he's much more capable than just what his magic can do. And that ultimately leads her to walk away from her position as the leader of the comically villainous Blue Moon Party, as she chooses to follow Desir instead. And finally, while I've already spoken about it a bit, this series lacks any exciting flair to keep you invested due to how mediocre the animation is. Look, it isn't something like X-Arm or Arifureta, but it's just flat out boring. Fight scenes feel slow and awkward, sometimes just downright snooze fest with how much of the movement animation is cut out in order to spare the effort of a decent fight scene. I was genuinely bored with what should have been some of the biggest and most exciting moments in the series, where Desir and crew face off against powerful rivals, and in the end when Desir faces one of the big villains of the series. Even the CGI used for the magic attacks is subpar CGI that not only looks awkward on its own, but was complemented in its mediocrity by blurred out speed line backgrounds that make it lack any sort of excitement or energy. Look, I shouldn't be skipping through fight scenes to see who wins, but these generally left me with no desire to sit there and watch. It was just still frames, a little bit of dialogue, and some speed lines for the most part. With how little draw power all these action sequences had, I could not give it high marks at all. Frustratingly enough, the series had a solid foundation in things it could have worked with, but it is overwhelmingly middling in just about every way all of these ideas are deployed. The idea of it intrigues me, and it's not like the characters are awful, but the whole thing feels like a first draft accidentally got published. Its animation leaves so much to be desired, and the overall writing just felt like it skipped way too many developmental moments for characters and blitzed through so much of a major story element to actually reach the place they do by the end of the first season. The focus was on reaching a point in the main plot of the series and not actually developing a story in a way that makes you feel anything for the characters or the world. It's just a generic save-the-day story with no flavor. And with no sense of visual appeal, there's not much I can credit positively to this series outside of the premise and a small bit of the character work. It lacks any individuality, any real creativity, and any love, is what it feels like. And the longer I watch this series, the more I question how it even came to exist. If the original web novel's writing is in this state of shambles, I have to question just what the hell is going on that boosted this series into being an anime. In the end, what potential it had and what parts of it interested me were drowned out by a production that just barely managed to not suck. My honest assessment of this series is a perfect mid. 5 out of 10. Whether or not this is due to a bad adaptation of source material, I cannot speak to. I was told this would be one of the best returner stories I'd ever experienced, and I am genuinely not seeing it with how this anime panned out. And it is, as I said, half-baked. In the end, a returner's magic just wasn't all that special. But that's enough out of me. If you like this video, please consider hitting those magic like and subscribe buttons, as those simple but free actions do really help me. And if you have thoughts to share, consider putting them down in the comments below. I hope you return for the next one. Later.